The resignation letter landed on Mayor Davidson's desk on a quiet Tuesday morning in March. It was brief, typed on standard library letterhead, and gave no explanation beyond the required 2 weeks' notice. Elena Chun, head librarian, Millbrook Public Library, effective immediately upon completion of transition period. What the letter didn't mention was a previous job title that Elena had deliberately omitted from her library employment application 15 years earlier: Emergency Management Coordinator for FEMA Region 7, responsible for disaster response coordination across 7 states and over 12 million residents. What the town of Millbrook didn't know was that their quiet, helpful librarian, the woman who recommended perfect mystery novels and helped children with homework, had spent the previous decade and a half coordinating responses to some of the most devastating natural disasters in American history. Elena's FEMA career had begun in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, when she was recruited directly from her graduate program in emergency management at Georgetown University. Her first assignment had been coordinating shelter operations for 15,000 evacuees in Houston, a trial by fire that taught her the difference between theoretical emergency management and the reality of human crisis. Over the following 15 years, Elena had managed responses to disasters that made headlines across the nation. The 2011 tornado outbreak that devastated multiple states. The Colorado wildfires that consumed entire communities. The Mississippi River floods that displaced hundreds of thousands. Each disaster had taught her new lessons about human behavior under stress, about the critical importance of communication systems, and about the deadly gaps that often existed between official emergency plans and actual community needs. Her specialty had become what FEMA called rapid community assessment, the ability to quickly evaluate a location's vulnerabilities and design customized emergency response protocols. Elena could walk through a town for 2 hours and identify its weak points: which roads would flood first, where traffic bottlenecks would trap evacuees, which buildings could serve as emergency shelters, and how to establish communication when standard systems failed. By 2008, Elena was leading FEMA Region 7, responsible for Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, and Nebraska, over 12 million people across some of the most disaster-prone territory in the United States. Tornado Alley, floodplains, agricultural areas vulnerable to both drought and flooding. Her decisions during crisis situations directly affected the safety of millions of people. But the stress had been overwhelming. 15 years of sleeping with emergency phones next to her bed. 15 years of making decisions where hesitation could cost lives. 15 years of seeing communities destroyed and families displaced. Elena had saved thousands of lives, but the psychological toll of constant crisis management had nearly destroyed her own. The breaking point had come during the 2010 Missouri River floods, when Elena had been awake for 72 consecutive hours coordinating evacuations across 3 states. Standing in a temporary command center, watching families lose everything they had worked for their entire lives, she realized that she couldn't continue. The weight of responsibility, the constant pressure, the knowledge that every decision could mean life or death for thousands of people. It had become too much to bear. Elena had submitted her resignation to FEMA quietly, without fanfare or explanation. She had served her country with distinction, saved countless lives, and earned the respect of colleagues across the federal emergency management community. But she was exhausted, burned out, and desperately needed peace. The job interview for Millbrook's head librarian position had been almost comically simple after years of congressional hearings and federal briefings. The 3-person hiring committee, Mayor Davidson, School Superintendent Patricia Walsh, and longtime library board member Robert Sterling, had asked standard questions about library science and community programming. Elena had answered honestly about her library science degree, earned during her early years at FEMA, when she was still optimistic about balancing multiple careers. She mentioned her experience with information systems and database management, skills that transferred perfectly from emergency coordination to library operations. She had carefully avoided mentioning the crisis management experience that dominated her resume. When they asked why she wanted to work in a small-town library after living in Washington, D.C., Elena had given them a version of the truth. She was seeking a quieter pace of life, a chance to serve community in a more peaceful way, an opportunity to focus on helping people access information and resources without the pressure of life or death decisions. The hiring committee had been charmed by her obvious competence and her apparent desire for small-town simplicity. They offered her the position immediately, at a salary that was less than half what she had earned at FEMA, in a town where the most exciting event was the annual Harvest Festival. Librarian in Millbrook, population 2,847, seemed like the perfect retirement from a career that had consumed every waking moment of her adult life. But old habits die hard, and expertise doesn't simply disappear with a change of job title. From her first day at the Millbrook Library, Elena couldn't help but notice things that others overlooked. The building's location at the town's geographic center, the sturdy 1930s construction that had weathered 8 decades of storms, the basement that could serve as a shelter, the communication systems that ran through the building, the fact that nearly every resident of Millbrook visited the library at least once a month, making it the unofficial heart of the community. What started as professional instinct gradually became something more deliberate. During quiet afternoon hours, when the library was empty except for a few regular patrons, Elena began what she privately called Project Safeguard. Using her own resources and the library's internet access, she started mapping Millbrook's vulnerabilities. The initial assessment had been sobering. Millbrook was located in a river valley, making it vulnerable to both flash flooding and the kind of catastrophic flooding that could result from dam failure upstream. The town had only 3 main roads, creating potential evacuation bottlenecks. The volunteer fire department had limited equipment and no training in large-scale emergency response. The nearest hospital was 35 miles away. Cell phone coverage was spotty in several neighborhoods. Most concerning of all, Millbrook had no emergency management plan beyond a basic disaster response protocol that hadn't been updated since 1987. The plan assumed that county emergency services would coordinate any major response. But Elena knew from experience that small communities were often last on the priority list during regional disasters. Over her first year in Millbrook, Elena began developing what would become the most comprehensive community emergency management system ever created by a single individual. Working during library off hours and using her own FEMA contacts, she started building the infrastructure that would eventually save every life in town. She studied floodplains and identified which neighborhoods would be affected by different levels of river rise. She analyzed traffic patterns and determined optimal evacuation routes that would avoid bottlenecks, even if primary roads were flooded. She researched the structural integrity of public buildings and identified which could serve as emergency shelters. She mapped cell tower locations and identified dead zones where communication would fail during emergencies. The mapping phase took 6 months and involved Elena walking every street in Millbrook, timing travel between locations, identifying potential hazards, and assessing the emergency response capacity of every building. She disguised this work as casual walks and community exploration, often carrying library books to deliver to homebound patrons as cover for her systematic neighborhood assessments. Elena discovered that Mrs. Patterson on Elm Street was bedridden and would need special evacuation assistance. She learned that the Johnson family had 3 small children and would require extra time to prepare for emergency evacuation. She identified that Mr. Crawford, the elderly veteran who lived alone on Pine Street, was hard of hearing and might not receive standard emergency alerts. All of this information went into a comprehensive emergency response plan that Elena developed over her first 3 years in Millbrook. She disguised her work as research for a community history project, occasionally asking longtime residents about past floods, storms, and other local disasters. No one suspected that their cheerful librarian was conducting the kind of detailed vulnerability assessment that most towns paid consultants thousands of dollars to complete. Elena's plan wasn't just theoretical. Using her FEMA contacts and her own expertise, she quietly arranged for emergency supplies to be stored in the library's basement. She coordinated with regional emergency services to ensure Millbrook was included in communication networks. She even arranged for backup power systems and satellite communication equipment, all funded through grants she applied for using her knowledge of federal emergency management programs. The grant applications had been works of art, written by someone who understood exactly what federal agencies wanted to hear. Elena knew which programs had unused funding, which bureaucrats made final decisions, and how to present Millbrook's needs in language that would guarantee approval. Over 12 years, she secured over $180,000 in federal emergency preparedness grants for the library and the town. The basement transformation had been gradual but systematic. Elena converted and used storage areas into emergency supply caches, carefully organized and climate-controlled. Medical supplies, non-perishable food, water purification tablets, emergency communication equipment, backup power sources, and cold weather clothing. Everything needed to support several hundred people for up to a week. She established relationships with regional emergency services that most small towns never developed. The county emergency management director knew Elena as the helpful librarian who asked good questions about emergency protocols. The state emergency management agency had Elena on their contact list as a community liaison for information distribution. The National Weather Service included the Millbrook Library in their direct alert system. Most importantly, Elena had built a comprehensive database of every Millbrook resident, including contact information, medical needs, mobility limitations, and family connections. This database, disguised as library patron records and community programming information, would prove essential during the actual emergency. Elena had created detailed evacuation routes that accounted for the specific needs of different neighborhoods. She knew that Riverside Avenue would flood first, requiring early evacuation. She understood that Main Street would become impassable once water levels reached 4 feet, necessitating alternate routes through residential areas. She had identified which residents owned trucks or larger vehicles that could assist with evacuations, and which families had boats that could be used for water rescues if necessary. The communication system Elena designed was particularly sophisticated. She had established redundant contact methods for every household: landline phones, cell phones, email addresses, and even physical addresses for emergency personnel to visit if other communication methods failed. She had created a phone tree system that could reach every resident within 20 minutes, and she had trained 12 community volunteers to serve as neighborhood coordinators during emergencies. Elena's training program for community volunteers had been disguised as library programming. She organized community preparedness workshops that taught basic emergency response skills under the guise of general civic education. Participants learned CPR, basic first aid, emergency communication protocols, and shelter management procedures. Many residents attended these workshops thinking they were simply learning useful life skills, unaware that they were being trained to serve as emergency response coordinators. The town council, focused on budget discussions and zoning disputes, never questioned why their little library seemed to receive so many federal infrastructure grants. Elena's applications were always perfectly written, completely justified, and submitted by someone who clearly understood exactly what federal agencies were looking for in emergency preparedness initiatives. For 12 years, Elena's system remained hidden in plain sight. The library became a community hub, not just for books and programs, but for the subtle emergency preparedness infrastructure that Elena had woven throughout the building. Few people noticed the weather monitoring equipment disguised as a reading garden ornament. No one questioned the unusually robust internet and communication systems. The emergency supply room in the basement was marked simply as library storage. Elena conducted regular drills disguised as routine maintenance. She would test communication systems during library technology updates. She practiced evacuation procedures during fire safety inspections. She verified supply inventories during seasonal cleaning projects. Every aspect of her emergency response system was tested and refined continuously, ensuring that it would function perfectly when needed. The psychological preparation had been just as important as the physical infrastructure. Elena had spent years building trust and credibility within the community. She made sure that residents saw her as a reliable, knowledgeable person who could be counted on during difficult situations. When the emergency finally came, people would instinctively trust her guidance because she had established herself as someone who always had accurate information and good judgment. Elena had hoped her system would never be needed. She imagined retiring quietly in a few more years, perhaps gradually transfer her knowledge to local emergency services without revealing the full extent of what she had built. She pictured Millbrook continuing its peaceful existence, protected by systems that would never need to be activated. But nature had other plans. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Wednesday in late September. Elena's phone rang with a tone she had programmed for emergency alerts, a sound she hadn't heard in years but would never forget. The automated voice was crisp and urgent. "This is a National Weather Service. A dam failure emergency has been declared for the Clearwater River system. Immediate evacuation recommended for all residents within 5 miles of the river corridor." The Clearwater Dam had been built in 1962 to control flooding and provide water for agricultural irrigation. Recent inspections had noted some structural concerns, but nothing that suggested immediate danger. The 3 days of unprecedented rainfall had changed everything. Weather stations upstream were reporting precipitation levels that exceeded 100-year flood projections. The dam spillways were operating at maximum capacity, but water levels continued rising. At 2:30 a.m., dam monitoring equipment had detected a stress fracture in the main structure. Engineering analysis suggested that the fracture was expanding and that complete dam failure was not just possible, but probable. Computer models indicated that failure could occur anywhere from 2 to 6 hours after the initial crack detection. Elena was fully awake before the message finished. The Clearwater Dam, 18 miles upstream from Millbrook, had developed a catastrophic crack following 3 days of unprecedented rainfall. Computer models predicted complete dam failure within 2 to 4 hours. The resulting flood would send a wall of water down the Clearwater River, directly through the heart of Millbrook. Elena's FEMA experience immediately kicked in. She began running calculations that had become second nature during her federal career. Dam failure scenarios, water volume and flow rates, population density in the flood zone, evacuation timing requirements, available resources and coordination challenges. The math was sobering. The Clearwater Dam held approximately 2.3 billion gallons of water. Complete failure would release a flood surge that would reach Millbrook in approximately 45 minutes. The initial wave would be 15 to 20 feet high, traveling at approximately 30 miles per hour. Everything within a quarter mile of the river would be completely destroyed within minutes of the flood's arrival. Local emergency services were overwhelmed. 3 counties were affected, and Millbrook, as the smallest community in the flood path, was last on the priority list for official coordination. The County Emergency Management Office had a skeleton crew working overnight, and their primary focus was on evacuating the larger cities downstream. Elena lay in bed for perhaps 30 seconds, processing the information and running calculations in her head. 2 to 4 hours to evacuate 2,847 people. No official coordination yet available. Standard evacuation procedures would take at least 6 hours under optimal conditions. This was exactly the kind of scenario she had spent years preparing for, even though she had hoped it would never come. She got dressed quickly, drove to the library, and activated her system. The Millbrook Library transformed within minutes from a quiet community building into a sophisticated emergency coordination center. Elena's hidden equipment came online, establishing communication links with county emergency services, state emergency management, and federal disaster response networks. Her emergency protocols, tested in simulation but never in reality, began functioning exactly as designed. Elena's first action was to activate the early warning network she had established. Weather monitoring equipment throughout the town began transmitting real-time data about wind, precipitation, and river levels. Communication systems established contact with emergency services at county, state, and federal levels. Backup power systems ensured that operations could continue even if local electrical service failed. The automated phone system that Elena had programmed began its sequence. Every telephone number in Millbrook, landlines, cell phones, business numbers, received the same message within 12 minutes of Elena's arrival at the library. The message was calm, clear, and specific. Immediate evacuation was required due to dam failure upstream. Specific evacuation routes were designated for each neighborhood, and emergency shelters were prepared outside the flood zone. But Elena didn't rely solely on automated systems. Her 12 years in Millbrook had taught her which residents might need additional assistance. Elderly residents who might not answer their phones at 3 a.m., families with young children who would need extra time to prepare, people with medical conditions who would require special transportation arrangements. The first calls went out at 3:15 a.m. Elena had developed a phone tree that could reach every household in Millbrook within 20 minutes. Using contact information gathered over 12 years of library patron records, combined with voter registration data and utility company records, she had created the most comprehensive communication network in the county's history. Elena had identified 12 community coordinators, residents who were well-connected, reliable, and had good communication skills. These were people like Reverend Thompson from the Methodist Church, who knew every family in his congregation. Carol Martinez, who ran the day care center and had contact information for most families with young children. Jim Bradshaw, who managed a hardware store and knew many of the town's older residents. Elena contacted each coordinator directly, providing them with specific information about the emergency and asking them to verify that everyone in their networks had received and understood the evacuation instructions. This human verification system ensured that the message reached everyone, even those who might have missed the automated alerts. But Elena didn't present herself as a former FEMA coordinator who had built the system. Instead, she positioned herself as a librarian who happened to have access to emergency information. This approach was deliberate. People trusted their librarian, and they were more likely to follow instructions from someone they knew than from an unknown emergency official. This is Elena from the library. Her calls began. I'm contacting you because we received word of a potential flood emergency. The county has asked community leaders to help coordinate an immediate evacuation. I have detailed information about safe evacuation routes and shelter locations. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within an hour, Millbrook's residents were moving in an organized evacuation that proceeded with efficiency that would later be studied by emergency management professionals across the country. Elena's traffic routing prevented the gridlock that typically occurs during emergency evacuations. Her shelter assignments ensured that every resident had a predetermined safe location. Her communication system kept everyone informed of changing conditions and timing. Elena's evacuation plan accounted for every possible complication. She had arranged for school buses to transport residents who didn't have vehicles. She had coordinated with local farmers to provide trucks for families with large amounts of livestock or equipment to move. She had established medical transport for residents who were bedridden or had mobility limitations. The shelter locations Elena had selected were strategically positioned outside the flood zone, but close enough to Millbrook that residents wouldn't feel completely displaced. She had pre-positioned emergency supplies at each location, including food, water, bedding, medical supplies, and communication equipment. Each shelter had trained volunteers ready to manage operations and provide support to evacuees. By 5:30 a.m., less than 3 hours after the initial alert, Millbrook was completely evacuated. Every resident, every pet, every person who had been visiting or working in town had been safely moved to designated shelter areas outside the flood zone. The dam failed at 6:43 a.m. The wall of water that roared through Millbrook destroyed or damaged 80% of the town's buildings. Main Street disappeared under 12 feet of rushing water. The flood carried away cars, destroyed the post office, and left mud and debris 3 feet deep throughout the downtown area. But every single person survived. Not just survived, They had been evacuated so efficiently that most residents watched the flood from safe locations, with hot coffee and emergency supplies that Elena had pre-positioned in shelter areas years earlier. News crews arrived by helicopter around 8 a.m., expecting to cover a disaster with casualties and chaos. Instead, they found an orderly evacuation that had proceeded like a perfectly executed military operation. Residents were safe, accounted for, and remarkably well prepared for what should have been a catastrophic surprise. "How did you manage such an efficient evacuation?" asked the first reporter to arrive at the main shelter location, a community center 15 miles from Millbrook. Mayor Davidson looked around for Elena, but she had quietly disappeared from the shelter once it became clear that everyone was safe. "Our librarian," he said simply. Elena coordinated everything. She somehow had access to all the emergency protocols and communication systems. The initial news reports focused on the remarkable survival rate and the efficient evacuation, but didn't identify the coordination source. Millbrook's emergency response exceeded all expectations, reported Channel 7 News. Despite receiving only 2 hours warning of the dam failure, the entire community was evacuated safely through what appears to be a sophisticated emergency management system. It took 3 days for the full story to emerge. As county emergency management officials debriefed the evacuation, they began asking questions about the sophisticated coordination they had witnessed, the communication systems, the pre-positioned supplies, the detailed evacuation routes, the comprehensive resident contact database. This wasn't the kind of emergency response that a small town typically could execute without years of planning and significant federal resources. The investigation led to Elena's quiet resignation letter, which had been forgotten in the chaos of the emergency. When Mayor Davidson mentioned that their librarian had submitted her resignation right before coordinating the evacuation, county officials began digging deeper into her background. What they discovered changed everything. Elena Chun wasn't just a librarian who had handled the emergency well. She was Elena Chun, former emergency management coordinator for FEMA Region 7, the architect of disaster response protocols that had saved thousands of lives across 7 states. The woman who had quietly stamped books and helped children with homework for 12 years was one of the most accomplished emergency management professionals in the country. The system that had saved Millbrook hadn't been improvised during the crisis. It had been 15 years in the making. 3 years of FEMA expertise applied to developing the plan, and 12 years of careful implementation disguised as normal library operations. Federal emergency management officials arrived in Millbrook within a week, not to coordinate disaster relief, but to study what Elena had built. Her evacuation protocols were more efficient than anything in the Federal Disaster Response Handbook. Her communication systems had functioned flawlessly under emergency conditions. Her supply distribution had ensured that evacuees had everything they needed within hours of leaving their homes. Dr. Janet Morrison from the Federal Emergency Management Agency spent 3 weeks in Millbrook documenting Elena's system. Her preliminary report described the evacuation as the most efficient community-level emergency response in modern American history. This represents a perfect integration of professional emergency management expertise with detailed local knowledge. Dr. Morrison wrote, "The system demonstrates how federal resources can be leveraged at the community level to create resilience that far exceeds what either federal coordination or local preparation could achieve independently." Elena had left one final document in her resignation materials, a complete guide to the system she had built, including detailed instructions for maintaining and updating the emergency protocols. The manual was 847 pages long, covering everything from equipment maintenance schedules to psychological support procedures for evacuation shelter management. She had also left contact information for federal agencies that could provide ongoing support and recommendations for local personnel who could be trained to continue her work. The transition plan was so comprehensive that Millbrook could maintain the emergency response system indefinitely without Elena's direct involvement. The town council held an emergency meeting to discuss Elena's resignation and to understand what she had built. They found that their quiet librarian had, over 12 years, transformed Millbrook into one of the best prepared communities in the country for natural disasters. Her system was so comprehensive that federal agencies began requesting permission to study it as a model for other small communities. But Elena herself had quietly disappeared. She had moved out of her small apartment near the library and left no forwarding address. The federal agencies that tried to contact her found that she had effectively vanished, leaving behind only the system she had built and the lives she had saved. 6 months later, a package arrived at the Millbrook Library. Inside was a letter addressed to the town council and a comprehensive update to Elena's emergency management protocols, adjusted based on lessons learned from the dam failure evacuation. The system belongs to Millbrook now, her letter read. It was always meant to be yours. I simply built it and tested it for you. Use it well. Maintain it carefully, and remember that the best emergency response is the one that prevents emergencies from becoming disasters. The letter was signed simply Evacuation Librarian. 5 years later, Elena's emergency management system had been adopted by 47 communities across 6 states. The Millbrook model became the gold standard for small-town emergency preparedness. Federal agencies offered grants specifically for communities that wanted to implement Elena's protocols. Emergency management schools taught case studies based on her evacuation procedures. The Millbrook Library was renamed the Elena Chun Community Emergency Resource Center, though it continued to function as a library as well. The building served as both a repository of books and knowledge, and as a command center for one of the most sophisticated community emergency management systems in the country. Elena's trace lived on in every life saved by communities that implemented her model. Her legacy continued in every evacuation that proceeded smoothly, because communities had learned from her example. Her impact multiplied through every emergency management professional who studied her work and carried her innovations to new communities. The resignation letter that had seemed so brief and unremarkable had been, in reality, the end of a 15-year mission. Elena had come to Millbrook to retire from emergency management, but had instead created her masterpiece, a comprehensive disaster preparedness system that would protect not just one community, but dozens of communities for decades to come. In the end, the quiet librarian who stamped books and recommended novels had left the most important trace of all, a system that valued every life, prepared for every possibility, and proved that expertise combined with dedication could build protection that would last generations. Some traces fade with time. Elena Chen's trace grew stronger each year as more communities adopted her model and more lives were saved by the system she had built in the quiet hours between helping patrons find their next favorite book. 20 years after the dam failure, the Millbrook model had been credited with saving over 12,000 lives across multiple disasters. The quiet librarian's legacy had become exactly what she had always intended. Not a monument to her own expertise, but a living system that would continue protecting communities long after she was forgotten. But in Millbrook, Elena Chun was never forgotten. Her trace was carved not in stone, but in the lives she had saved and the example she had set. In a world where heroes often sought recognition, she had chosen to build something more lasting, a system that would continue her work long after she was gone. That, perhaps, was the most important trace of all.